Hello, everyone, and welcome to Azam Sharp Weekly. This is the second part of building the budget app. And make sure that you check out my brand new course, MV Design Pattern in iOS, Build SwiftUI apps using Apple's Way. So you can find the link for this particular course right there in the description. And the budget app is actually explained in more detail in this particular course. Okay. So we left our course, we left our video or our budget app where we can add a category. So you can see that right now I have only one category added, which is called vacation. I can go ahead and add a new category. I can call it food with a budget of, let's say, 200. And that works fine. All of this information is stored in the SQLite database through the use of core data. But what we want to do is also allow the user to add transactions for each category. If we go and look at our model for the core data, you will find out that there is no entity that we have currently which can be used to store the transaction. So the first thing I'm going to do is add a transaction or add an entity. So let's go ahead and add an entity. I will simply call it transaction. Now I've created the entity called transaction, but I also have to say that, well, what will be the attributes of that entity? I'm going to make it simple. I'm just going to go ahead and add an attribute called title. This can be the actual transaction title. So maybe for your vacations, this might be the airfare, this might be the car rental, the food that you eat and all that stuff, the hotel. And I'm going to go ahead and make this a string, keeping in mind that this is also not optional, so you do have to provide that. Next up, I'm going to say amount, and that will be double. And again, this is not optional, so you do have to provide that part. Now we have to go back to the budget category. If you go back to the budget category, you can see this section about relationship. So one budget category can have relationship with a transaction because a budget can have a lot of transactions. So it's a one-to-many relationship. I'm going to go ahead and add a new property over here, or new relationship. We will call it transactions. The destination, I will put it as transaction. Inverts, we will take a look at that later. But once you add that, and if you select it, let's go ahead and check out these properties over here. You can see that the relationship type is set to 1. Now, we don't really want this to be 1, so I'm going to go ahead and say too many. And everything else is fine. Let's go ahead and jump into transaction. And in the transaction, I'm going to add another relationship, kind of like an inverse relationship. We will call it budget category. This is going to allow us to know that this transaction belongs to which category. We're going to select budget category. Inverse will be transaction. That's fine. And this will be a 2-1 relationship. A transaction can belong to a budget category. Let's go back to our budget category, and you can see everything is set up now correctly. That's fine. Great. All right. Okay. So what's the next thing that we want to perform? We can go to the content view. This is where we are going to look at all the different categories. Now, at this point, we want the user to also go to the budget detail view. So if I add a budget over here, let's see if I can add a budget over here. I will call it vacations with an amount of, let's say 500. So if I have this particular budget that I added, I want to click on it, I want to tap on it so that I can go to a budget detail view where I can look at the transaction associated with vacations budget. So this means we need a view. So I'm going to go ahead and add a new group. We'll call it views. And I will add a new file for a view. You can call this anything you want. I'm just going to go ahead and go with a simple name. Let's say budget detail view. Perfect. Okay. Now, in the budget detail view, how will that work? Well, the budget detail view needs to have access to the budget category. So somebody is going to be passing in the budget category, which is budget category. Now you also have this preview part, which is saying that you must pass in the budget category. And it's a little bit different if you want to do that, because you will need to get a view context. So it's a little bit more code that you will have to type. And in the end, we may not even see anything. Because the previews, we don't really have any data in there. So I'm just going to say request, trying to request a particular budget category dot fetch request. We will get the results. Fetch the request. Perfect. And now we can actually wrap this with a navigation stack just for display purposes. And we can pass in the budget category, which will be results of 0, the first one. And we will also go ahead and put the environment path as the manage object context will be VC. So this is all done so that our previews can kind of work. I don't know if it's going to display anything right now, but at least we will be able to do something. Okay. So now we have the budget detail view. And what we want to do is we want the user to add a budget. We also want to kind of like show them a little bit more information about the budget category amount that we're talking about. So let's go ahead and add that. So I'm going to remove that. I'm going to say vstack. And I will go ahead and set the alignment to be leading. Now, the first order of business is to show the current budget of this category. So we can use a text control over here. And I can say budget category dot amount and as a number, NS number. And I think we already have a formatter that we created earlier on, number formatter dot currency. So this is going to allow us to show the amount, and you can actually see the amount. So that's pretty good that in the preview we are able to show this amount. All right, I think this is amount for the vacations or something. Great. Let's go ahead and add length to it. Perfect. We can add a spacer so that it kind of pushes it on the top. And always a good idea to give a little bit more padding. So let's go ahead and add a padding to our vstack. And now it looks much better. So that is our budget. That is $400. Now you can make it much more nicer by typing like, well, this is a budget for whatever category. That's up to you. And that's more covered in the actual course. And the link is right there in the description. The other thing that we want to add is a form that allows the user to enter the title of the transaction and the amount of the transaction. So this means we need two different state variables where we can push that information. And we will be able to add those two text fields because that is how the user is going to enter their title and also the amount for the transaction. Okay. Next up, we are going to allow the user, to go ahead and press a button. I will go ahead and say button. That's called add transaction. There we go. And right now it will be disabled and it will be based on the property called isFormValid. Now what exactly is this property isFormValid? Well, isFormValid is simply a property that is going to find out that if the form is valid or not. So we will create this property. I think we can make it a private property also. So isFormValid. And this will be a Boolean. We can check if the title is not empty and the amount is not empty. Make sure that you put the not. And the amount is numeric, meaning you're only entering the numbers, and the amount is greater than 0, then only is form valid will be true. All right. Right now, I don't think we even see the button at this point. So we make sure that we are adding the button. So let me go ahead and add a spacer also. Okay, I think the button is kind of like at the bottom right now for some reason. But anyway, we at least have a button in there. I think it's at the bottom. We'll fix that later. All right, so now let's go ahead and type something over here. So if I'm going to type food, and you can see the button is now available, button is now valid. All right, so that's how it's working. Now, when you click on the button, we need to save the transaction. So we're going to call a function called save transaction. Okay, now we don't really have that function. So let's go ahead and create that function over here. Private function save transaction. Now this is just a function. I mean, all the actual stuff is being done in the actual view context. So the first thing we're going to do is we will create a transaction. So transaction, and passing in the context, which can be a view context. So we need to get that also. We don't really have any access to the view context, but the good thing is that we can just look into the environment and get that stuff. There we go. All right. We will assign the title. Transaction.title is equals to title. Transaction.amount equals to double amount. Hopefully at this point it's already validated, so we can go ahead and do the force. That's fine. Now finally we want to take this transaction and add it to the budget category. We already have access to the budget category since it is passed to you. And when you create these relationships in core data file, you can see that this particular function add to transaction automatically appears, which is great because now I can simply go ahead and say add to transaction, and then I can simply call view context.save. Great. So you can see that now it should work. Now, if obviously I'm using a try optional over here, you should probably do a do and try and catch. And if there's any error displayed on the screen, that's up to you. But you can see that we can save a particular transaction and associate that transaction with a budget category. So this should save us the transaction. All right. Now, if we want to display the transaction, and we will eventually display the transactions, it's just that we will display it a little bit later on by putting it in a transaction list view or a different kind of a control. But what if we wanted to display the transaction? I can say budget category dot transactions. But if you note over here, the transactions are in a set. It's not an array. So if you try to do this, it's really probably not going to work. All right, so t.title or whatever you want to display, it's not going to like that. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we are looping through an array. And there are many ways of doing that. The one that I'm going to show you over here, we will remove it. Don't worry about it. I just want to see the transaction. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a private property called transaction array. And I would even write it over here that we are going to remove it. We are going to remove this later. Do not use. All right. We're just using it just to see that if the transactions are actually getting displayed or not. Okay. Next, I'm going to go ahead and unwrap the transactions which are coming from the budget category dot transactions. Else we will return empty string. And if the transactions are there, then we can use the all objects property of transaction and convert it into a particular array of transactions. There we go. You can see force unwrap or force casting. Not a good idea. But again, we are just trying to see if the transactions are there or not. So what about if I say transactions array in there? We will call it transaction and just displaying these values. So I will say transaction dot title or empty. Just want to see if the transaction is actually being added or not. So let's go ahead and run this. Well, now the problem is that we can't even go to that screen, the detail screen. If you go to the content view is simply displaying this H stack with all the categories, but it's not really allowing us to go anywhere. So what should we do? Well, we can use a navigation link, and in the navigation link, I believe we can pass in the value and the label. The value is what the value you want to pass. So I'm just going to say budget category. And the label is the one that gets displayed on the screen. Now, currently, it's not really going to do much. And the reason it's not going to do anything is that we still have not specified the navigation destination. So now I can go ahead and say navigation destination for a budget category, because that is what we're selecting. We will get a budget category. So we can call it budget category. And now it is our duty to simply go ahead and say budget category and category view, I guess, budget category view, which is somewhere, budget category view. I think that's what budget detail view. That's why it's not coming up, typing the wrong name, and passing in the budget category. Okay. Looks good. Let's go ahead and run this and at least see that can we even reach the other screen. So it looks like we can. $200, $400. Now, what about if I add this particular something for my vacation? So I'm going to say food, and this will be $50. Okay, so the first thing you note over here is that we don't know if the food is saved or not. That's the first thing. And if I go to over here, well, I guess it's saved because it's now displaying over here. You can see the food is getting displayed. All right. So whatever we add, let's say I'm adding, magnets, those refrigerator magnets, and that's going to cost like $10. I mean, I can add it, but it does not appear over here unless I go back and forth, and then I can see, oh, magnets are appearing. So they are getting saved in the database, but they are not getting displayed. So something fishy is going on that is preventing this to work. All right. So now the question becomes that what exactly is going on and how we can tackle this kind of a problem. For now, what we can do is write the code somewhere over here. That's fine. But eventually in the next video, what we want to do is we want to make sure that you are saving this information or you're putting this information into a transaction list view or a dedicated view that is responsible for displaying all the transactions or displaying everything. All right, so that is, I think, the important part. So let's see that how we can fix this problem. Now, one of the reasons, and it can be that it is not refreshing this, is that this particular view, even though you're adding a new transaction, which is changing the budget category object because it's adding one more transaction to the array, it's not really marked with observed object. And if you don't mark something with observer object, then it basically means that, well, whenever any changes to this object are going to happen, like maybe adding a new transaction or changing the name of the budget category or changing the budget, then the detail view will never get that notification because it was not observing it. So the detail view will never really refresh. So after that, let's go put the observed object, and let's go ahead and do the same thing again. I'm going to go to food this time, and I'm going to say that I'm going to buy my food budget. I just bought burgers. Let's say burgers is $10. And now you can see that they're being added. Burgers are being added, and I can go ahead and add like a Coke or something, and that can be like $3. And every time I'm adding something, it is refreshing the budget detail view, and all the different views that needs to get rendered, they get rendered, and it is updating. All right, so it looks like it is working successfully we are able to display our transactions for a particular budget. This is not really much of a reusable control or a component or a view. So eventually it will be a good idea if we move this into a different view. We can even call that a transaction list view, so that our code is much better. All right. But right now it is working, it's fine. But in the future lecture, in the future video, I will show you that how you can move it into a separate view and then utilize the new transaction list view, which will only show the transactions when they're passed to the transaction list view. All right. So that's pretty much it for today. Remember that this property will eventually be gone, and I have also written over here that we will not use this property. We will move this somewhere else. Okay. So that is pretty much it. Check out the link in the description. You will find a lot of links for different courses. Check out my course for MV design pattern. You are going to enjoy it, and hope you have enjoyed this video. Thank you so much.